So thank you for everyone for joining. My name is Stephen Jacobs. I am Director of Product Marketing here at Wirewheel, and we're here with Sara Watson, who's a Principal Analyst at Forrester. We're here first and foremost to celebrate Privacy Week. And we're celebrating Privacy Week with a conversation really about how privacy officers can extend their influence throughout the organization. We think this is critical. We think this is critical to the success not only of privacy as a occupation and an industry area, but also the mission of privacy and the privacy laws that are underneath them. So our focus today is really on the tech executive and helping privacy officers and folks on privacy teams understand how they can build the partnerships they need with the CIOs and CTOs to succeed. So I wanted to quickly launch a poll. Just if you want to launch it. So we wanted to start out by asking, what is your reporting structure as a privacy professional in your organization? Who do you report to? Do you report to the Chief Information Security Officer, the Chief Information Officer, the Chief Data Officer, legal, or other? So let's give it a minute. As we're doing that, so you want to go to the next slide? Do some quick introductions. Great. So as I said, we brought in Sara Watson, who's a principal analyst at Forrester, and she covers kind of technology leaders for the research firm. So data privacy and ethics are a key part of her coverage area. And so we wanted to bring in Sara to talk a bit about the challenges facing tech leaders today and really how privacy fits into those strategic priorities. And she's going to offer a few tips on what privacy leaders can do to turn that tech executive into a real ally for your program. Then we're going to have a bit of a conversation afterwards, and during which we'd love to hear your questions. This should be open format. Feel free to add questions to the Q&A feature. A few elements of housekeeping. The webinar is going to be available on replay probably in the next day or two. You will get an email when it's live. If you have any questions, please do not hesitate to reach out. And you know, we're happy to help where we can. Second, if you do have questions, please put them in the Q&A. But feel free to chat with other participants in the chat function as well. So Chris, do you have the results for that poll? Great. Okay, so mostly with the legal crowd, and I think this mostly reflects what we see generally, but very helpful. So why don't we get this started? I want to kick it over to you, Sara, and let's get the webinar started.
Sounds good. Thank you, Stephen. And yeah, that's certainly not any surprise to see those poll results, but I think is really good indication of, you know, just how much collaboration work needs to be done if you're kind of sitting in the legal side of things to actually start to get into these, you know, collaborative, business-oriented conversations about actually enabling privacy throughout the entire customer experience. So here at Forrester, I work with our technology executive clients, so CIOs and CTOs, but I have actually spent the last decade really steeped in questions about privacy and personal data, and even some tech policy in there. So I'm a little versed, more so than kind of most CIO focused people. And that's really what kind of drives me to be interested in this question of, you know, how privacy professionals and tech execs are actually going to start working more closely together as privacy becomes increasingly strategic to companies. And I'm also interested in how these two functions can actually learn from each other's transformation in having closer ties to the business and actually becoming more customer obsessed, which is something at Forrester we are obsessed with as well. So we know that the privacy function really is traditionally seen as a cost center as the goal of the organization really being focused on mitigating risk and ensuring compliance. And in some ways, that actually kind of parallels how the IT function used to be positioned within most large enterprises, as a infrastructure provider, a maintainer, keeping the lights on. But that model has really been completely disrupted as technology, of course, becomes essential to all business transformation. And so we think that future fit CIOs and CTOs now are partnering more closely with the business. And that means that they're measured not just in terms of cost or uptime, but also in terms of business outcomes. So today I want to walk through the importance of moving beyond that kind of compliance back-end side of cost center approach to privacy in the enterprise as we move towards privacy as this strategic partner in generating business value. But before we get into that, I really want to lay out the fact that there are these key levers I see as elevating the importance of privacy for basically all stakeholders right now. And obviously that starts, with law, right? Relatively new global regulations starting to protect privacy in new ways. But also we're starting to talk about things like the right to inferences or, algorithmic decision-making monitoring. And so all of that is really catching up to the reality of our data economy. And, I don't have to tell you folks, you're all in the legal side of things, this is putting the emphasis on first party relationships that shift to opt-in rather than opt-out consent models. But I ultimately think that that's really driving the idea of giving users more power over their data and more ability to demand their data. So of course, this is going to, drive the compliance function, but that's really, I think, just the floor and not the ceiling of where the kind of spirit of these changes are leading us. But next up, we are also increasingly seeing that values-based customers are demanding more privacy from platforms and from brands. 45% of US consumers have said that they're willing to pay for products in lieu of having companies collect, share, or sell their data. And that's from a really interesting Consumer Reports survey. And so there really is starting to be these indicators that there is a market for privacy. As all of these kind of social changes are happening, consumer norms and expectations are changing with regard to the customer experience as we become more digitally mature consumers. So that means that trust is becoming imperative to all of these business relationships. And yet at the same time, trust in technology as an industry is actually on the down trajectory. And according to Forrester's Consumer Analytics Technographics benchmark survey from last year, 20% of US online adults don't trust any company to keep their personal information secure. So trust is really becoming this core issue. And lastly, I see one major lever being how the shift towards all of these digital experiences has really demanded the integration of privacy considerations into the entire experience, into the code, right? It's not just talking about kind of check boxes and opt-outs, but rather thinking about what is the privacy experience throughout the entire ecosystem, throughout the entire experience. And so that's really starting to think more holistically about how these design choices can actually shape that experience. So I think, all of these forces are changing also the nature of what privacy actually means to consumers. And I think that definitional shift is really important because, when we talk about privacy, so many people are talking about very different things like legal privacy, kind of expectations of consent and context, right? So it's more, I think, moving away from this kind of very strict legal definition of privacy towards the ways that privacy shows up in these consumer experiences, these, how we're supporting consumer choice, how we're enabling self-determination and agency, and actually starting to speak to consumers' values in those experiences. And so in that effort, I think data is becoming the currency of trust. And future fit privacy functions will actually need to figure out how to support those emerging customer interactions and expectations as a means of partnering with the business in new ways and more involved ways. So the way we see that at Forrester is one of my colleagues, Emza Iannopoulos, has put together this framework for thinking about how we can start to elevate the privacy function. So this Forrester ladder of privacy as a competitive advantage can actually be a really helpful guide to kind of place yourself in your current organization to the level of privacy and competitive advantage that you can actually achieve today. And we totally admit that, you know, firms are maturing from this regulatory compliance position towards moving up to operational efficiency, and then moving into the kind of business strategic enablement, and finally moving up to enabling customer trust. And, you know, this is meant to be a maturity model, right? It's a process. Not every company is going to be in a position to reach the top of this ladder tomorrow. And so this really is about kind of thinking about where you are right now, where your current organization fits in, and how you can start to think about building towards the higher levels of this strategic positioning. But the way, so I love this model and I love what Emza has done with it. What I want to do today is to tie this framework into how the journey actually parallels how tech organizations have evolved towards more future fit strategies, and how the tech exec is actually thinking about making this kind of technology function more adaptive, creative, and resilient, and becoming more strategic to the business as well. So we see this similar span of maturity now horizontally rather than vertically, but we see this span of maturity across IT organizations within our tech exec practice. So many are on the path towards modernizing from this kind of back office infrastructure provider to becoming a more strategic partner and enabler. And based on our research, we see that current IT firms are falling into the following categories. So 59% of organizations still are very much in the traditional IT model. And that's, of course, because we're talking about very large enterprises that, you know, are big ships that take a lot to move in a new direction. 33% of organizations have developed modern IT practices. And so that's really where we're starting to see these closer ties to the business, more adaptive setups and infrastructure that's cloud-based and more dynamic, more agile. And finally, we are seeing that only the top 8% of firms are demonstrating these characteristics of what we call future fit. And that is really built on this concept that you are truly building an adaptive, creative, and resilient IT practice with very close ties to the business and shared accountability for business outcomes. And that's different than just enabling the business, right? It's actually being tied to revenue targets or kind of customer focused metrics. So I think privacy professionals and tech execs both, you know, obviously hold stakes in the firm's data, right? Like that's the ultimate thing that's kind of driving both practitioners, right? The CIO, it cares about information, right? So I think there's actually this huge opportunity to find partners in this path of kind of maturity and strategic relevance to the business. And future fit tech execs, I think, will inevitably need to partner more with privacy professionals to achieve some of these customer and business goals as privacy becomes more essential to the experience. So with the launch of Forrester Decisions, we have identified through pretty extensive research, client research, the top priorities that CIOs and CTOs have as technology executives. And so as you can see here, you know, privacy is naturally falling into this priority bucket of, you know, enabling, embedding privacy and security in the company to increase business continuity and mitigate risks. But I would argue that that positioning is still very much in the kind of compliance and security mitigation risk posture rather than an advantage, right? And so I actually think that privacy professionals have a role to play in each of these categories, not just kind of embedding privacy and security into the company. And I think there's opportunities to start talking about how privacy fits into the organizational structure, right? How do you start to talk about change management and embedding privacy protection principles in the engineering organization? Or in the case of emerging technology, how do you provide privacy-focused input on emerging tech pilot programs from the start of beginning those investigations of how you might use AI, or how you might start to talk about even the blockchain? So I think privacy really has to start making its way across all of these categories, and that's going to be the next level of maturity. And lastly, I want to focus on the idea that privacy, most importantly, needs to make its way into the tech exec's first and top priority, which is to plan, govern, and communicate the business value of technology. So that's covering everything from implement planning, budgeting, measurement, communication, and even governance capabilities that are really starting to tie these business targets and customer value clearly to the way that technology is actually enabling that. And we have found that 29% of global purchase influencers say that aligning IT performance metrics to business outcomes would actually be a high or critical priority for their firm in the next 12 months. That was according to our survey from last year. And I think this is really the greatest area that privacy professionals can learn from the IT's organization's journey to actually become this strategic partner in focusing on what those ways of communicating value are. So, of course, how do you practically do that, right? Privacy professionals and tech execs, I think, could future fit their approach to privacy metrics to actually develop some KPIs that look at key outcomes beyond compliance and start to focus more on things like business enablement and customer engagement. And of course, as I've said before, tech execs have gone through this exercise, right? They've already seen this transformation from focusing on like systems health and cost reduction and service efficiency. And we're actually starting to see that maybe tech execs will start to be targeted against they'll be gold on revenue. And that's a huge shift. So, in the realm of privacy KPIs, we are very familiar with, focusing on the number and frequency of incidents, or the number of customer inquiries you've received, or the number of privacy requests handled. So, according to ISACA data, 58% of firms, measure incidence response, 57 use data protection impact assessments and privacy impact assessments. You focus on things like training, but none of those really communicate business value, and they don't measure tangible outcomes to the business. The same survey found that 11%, or only 11% of firms are measuring customer or brand impact of privacy efforts. So what I want to propose here is a taste of some of the kind of future fit metrics that could help privacy professionals develop these closer ties to the business and to customer experiences. And some of these are technology driven, but some of them are really, in many ways, organizationally driven. So how do you start to find the right stakeholders to support these data-driven initiatives? Or how do you collaborate with the business on new projects? How do you keep track of that? And on the other side, starting to think about, how do you increase the trustworthiness of your brand? What are the metrics that could actually tie to that, right? How do you positively influence the customer experience? How do you contribute to creating the reputation of the brand? And so, some of that has to do with thinking about the number of transparency reports you've supported, or the number of customers opting in versus opting out, right? Like that is an indicator of change, indicator of kind of the health of the brand, and not just about the kind of, did you check a box or not, right? That's it. If you can start to tie it to the actual outcomes for the firm, for the brand, this will start to be a lot more speaking the language of the business rather than just kind of being a cost center. So again, screenshot this slide if you like. Hopefully, I would love to hear more about how these metrics line up with how you're thinking about your privacy organizations. And really, this is just a taste of some of the metrics that we've tossed around as we continue to think about how privacy can become more mature and more strategic to the business. And I absolutely encourage you to check out Enza's report that gets into this in more detail. And lastly, I just want to kind of blow this out into a little bit of an even bigger picture. And that is to say that, in my role at Forrester, I'm really starting to look at the ways that tech execs have started to build out their responsible and ethical tech organizations. So that's a really new area of research that we're getting into. And it starts to ask these questions about, okay, well, we've all started to talk about privacy by design and how that kind of starts to filter into the development cycle and DevOps. But how do we also start to think about that in relationship to our ethical AI efforts or our sustainability and ESG efforts with regard to how technology either increases our efficiency and our output, or has an impact on, how our partners in data centers are, how we're keeping track of their carbon footprint. So really starting to think about this holistically across the organization, and realizing that, the CIO or the CTO is in a position to coordinate some of those efforts, but also may need to actually take that on in the long term. And I think that's a really interesting area of evolution of the role of the tech exec, who is, has a larger impact on kind of understanding tech's impact on the globe, on society at large. And I think those are, you're starting to see those questions being asked of tech firms themselves, social media platforms and the like. But how does that start to filter into every organization as every company becomes more digitally focused, more technologically driven, and more kind of customer centric? So with that, I will land us there, and happy to keep talking about this.
Sara, thank you so much. That was terrific. I mean, I think one of the things that really resonates with us at WireWheel, we are, a leading privacy management software company. Having said that, it feels like we are coming through a next phase in privacy, where the initial thought was, how do I take something like the DSAR or a PIA or DPIA, and how do I just automate it? When in fact, to really elevate and grow the role of privacy, it's about changing behavior. So, I think one thing that's critical for us at WireWheel and how we think about this problem is, how do we use technology to change behavior that's deeply, deeply embedded, not only in the kind of IT organization, but me as a marketer, the way I think of data and use data. And so always meeting that first order demand, which is making sure that you as the privacy officer are meeting your compliance requirements and meeting those first order metrics. But second, how are you using technology to, build and gain credibility throughout the organization? So to me, that was just so valuable. I wanted to kind of bring it back from I think what is aspirational in a lot of the privacy community, which is getting there to, okay, I'm a privacy officer today, and I know you work with a lot of CIOs. Imagine I come into my organization, and the CIO just doesn't buy privacy as a strategic advantage. Can you talk a little bit about how you shift that, how you've seen CIOs shift from a cost center mentality to really seeing privacy as a strategic advantage, and what sort of that light bulb moment was for them from your conversations with tech execs?
Sure. Yeah. I think it really has to do with, starting to have that customer-centric shift, right? Like, I think, if you can start to not only think about your attitudes, but also kind of how your customers' lives are changing, that is really a good way to start. I think we've started to see those signals kind of filtering into a lot of different industries, and but also kind of the pressure coming from, if you look at the ways in which draft legislation is starting to talk about privacy in very different ways, right? It's not just kind of about data collection anymore, right? And it's more about how the algorithm is going to filter your experience, right? Do consumers have the ability to decide if they have the filtered news feed or the time reverse engineered or reverse chronological news feed, right? So like, even that kind of start of an indication of, well, would we call that privacy? Maybe. Like, that's about the overall experience, right? It's how do I understand how my data is being used, how it influences my experience, what I consume, and what my total kind of digital life looks like. And so when you start to kind of try to take that position, you're not just thinking about like, well, do I care or not if I'm getting targeted ads? How do we actually think about the kind of larger impact on society? So I think that's one thing. I think the other thing, I've seen companies kind of start to make the shift when they start to think about how their business model is changing, and how a data-driven business model or a kind of services-driven business model completely changes the relationship to the customer, right? So you take a car manufacturer, right? Like, what a car manufacturer did before is not the same thing that it does now, right? It wasn't just, it used to be that you just like bought a device and, as soon as it left the, conveyor belts, like it was yours to figure out. Now we're talking about like an ongoing relationship with services and with, more and more sensors and a kind of ongoing maintenance kind of monitoring system, that all of that is driven with data, right? Like there is a constant touch point between the car that's kind of speaking on behalf of the user back to the company, right? And so if you start to think about like how technology has changed that relationship and changed, the data interaction, et cetera, of course that becomes a privacy question as well, right? Like if you are always in communication, whether that's like a direct communication or just a systems communication, that becomes a new responsibility, a new data structure, a new kind of relationship. And once you can start to see that shift, then you can start to understand that like a car is a privacy question, right? A car is a space for privacy questions. And I think, those jumps are hard to make, but I think if you start to think about the like, well, that's because data is changing the business model, changing the relationship, and then you can start to get into, okay, well, that will materially have a huge impact on the business.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's one of the wild things is that, the car shortage in the US is caused by a chip shortage, right?
Well, right, because it's not just metal anymore.
Gotcha. So like, what do you, just to follow up on that, what do you, if I'm a new privacy officer at a company, right? I come in, what would you recommend just tactically as like your first steps to position yourself as a partner with the CIO or CTO? Like, what do you do as a privacy, like how should you bring up the conversation? How should you frame that conversation? Are there projects you should work on and you should propose?
Yeah, I mean, I think the big thing is to talk to everyone and like try to figure out, who your greatest advocates are, who's going to be getting what you're saying, right? Like find those people first. That's the obvious one. But I think, because the next step is to actually start to figure out like how you can have these shared metrics, shared governance models, shared frameworks for like how privacy is going to fit into those processes, right? It's not just the checkbox at the end of product development before you ship, right? It's how do you start to have those conversations from the start of, here's this new initiative that we're going to get into, here's this new digital transformation plan that we have for an app, like what does that conversation look like? And how do you make sure that you're a part of that conversation from the start? So I think that's huge. And I with regard to the CIO and CTO, I think figure out where their focus is and figure out, how they're thinking about their big initiatives, and, try to figure out, reverse engineering where you are essential to them, right? Like, how do you support them in those efforts and those initiatives? Because I think you're guaranteed that there's going to be a privacy element to any of those things. I think it's just a matter of figuring out how it makes their life better, or how you're going to help them, spot the pitfalls or the kind of challenges along the way, not as a kind of naysayer, but as a kind of enabler of like, well, can I be here and be the one to represent the consumer or the customer, right? Like who's going to make sure that work is being done?
I think it's great. I mean, in thinking about like that CTO and CIO, I think obviously one of the things you always go back to is, what are they bonused on? Like, what are their priorities today? And one thing I want to ask you is just like, are there common, urgent priorities? Like we're in the middle of a pandemic that they have that are sort of unique to this time that you're seeing across your clients, that are sort of maybe outside of the broader trends, but are like really focused on these urgent issues that are relevant to the last and next 12 months?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, understanding like where CIOs are, like they, over the last 2 years, had to just change everything, right? Like they had to be ready to be responsive to supply chain issues. They had to move everyone to virtual work. And in many cases, they were positioned to actually support that, right? It just took, the pandemic to make it an urgent situation, right? So I think, in many ways, we're seeing that our CIOs and CTO clients are, they did the job that they needed to do, right? It wasn't fun necessarily all the time, but they've been dynamic and resilient and adaptive in this current context, and so they've proven themselves as a partner, and as they've shown what's possible, right? How you can respond in a month's development cycle rather than taking a full year, right? So we're starting to see like agile works. Like we've seen all of these kinds of indications of modern and future fit approaches are actually working. And so I think the thing that they are focused on right now is like, well, how do we keep that up? How do we keep this relationship with the business very strong? How do we push things forward? How do we even, enable more innovation and more kind of future-oriented applications to, we've managed to do this thing to keep things going. Now, what can we do now that we've got the business's ear to like support these kind of directions? So I think there's huge opportunities there. I think, I think it's really just about like sustaining and maintaining that kind of adaptive positioning and resilient positioning.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. So, imagine we talked a little bit about, what the light bulb moment was for folks and tech execs who came around to privacy, right? But imagine I'm in the job for 6 or 12 months and I'm realizing that my CIO or my CTO really isn't woken up to privacy. They just aren't buying it. From your experience, do people change? Is there a way that, a privacy officer can help change minds or at least reduce the friction that skeptical tech exec might have on them being successful and meeting their goals as a privacy officer?
Yeah, I mean, I think I would go back to the latter, right? I think it's about like, what can you do in the short term to, address these kind of, if they're in the language of like, well, my goal is just operational efficiency, right? Like, I just want things to run smoothly and keep the lights on, and that's the way that they're talking. Like, okay, maybe those are the metrics that you need to talk about for right now, but you can kind of lay the groundwork to say, well, this is how we're going to think about it for the next year, but here's where we can start to expand our remit, or start to partner and start to tie to different metrics, right? So I think there's an argument to be made that like you have to meet people where they're at, and that I think that's where the latter is useful, to say like, what is our current attitude, what is our current structure, and how do I operate within that, and where do we want to go in the future, right? Like, so there's runway, there's kind of a narrative to tell that story, as you can start to think about becoming more in a more strategic position, but also that being a story about like, well, how does the tech exec, like, you understand that the tech exec is going to have a potentially different role down the line. How do you help them get there too?
Yeah, I think one thing we wanted to do, let's launch another poll. One thing we wanted to ask about, get that poll up.
Yes, where are you on the ladder?
Where are you? I think this is one of the things, right? I spent a lot of time in the privacy community, and I think we talk a lot about moving privacy to a strategic advantage, to this place that we all inherently believe in. But the question is, transformational change happens incrementally. So, I think one of the important things about your presentation was to say, IT executives have gone through this. It's not just a research note in Forrester. It's an actual real thing that's happened over the last 10 years, and there are steps there. So we just want to ask the folks here, like, where are you on this ladder, right? Are you just doing regulatory compliance, and that's probably where most people are, or have you gotten to the point where you're getting sustained compliance, whether you have a system, or maybe you're all the way up, maybe where a target company like Apple might be, which is really focusing on customer employee trust
and making it a part of the brand, right? Like that's a perfect example of like just how much it's part of the trust promise, right?
Yeah. So let's see if we have any results from that. There we go. Okay. Well, interesting. A lot of people. Does that seem right to you, Sarah?
I mean, yeah, I think it does. There's the range at the bottom, right? And I think that's a good place to be. And frankly, like, some of these regulatory requirements are relatively new, right? So that's where we should be, right?
Yeah, someone in the chat said just trying to get to regulatory compliance.
Exactly.
Right. So, I think one of the things that we've seen is, because it takes time for, the California, Attorney General Office to actually get enforcement action happening. If you're not getting, enforcement actions, do people care, right? Yeah. And unless you're an organization that has a culture of, compliance and regulatory risk, like you might be in finance, or you're a deeply consumer-facing business in which, headline risk is there, sometimes it's hard as well,
Yeah, I mean, and that goes back to the meeting people where they're at right now, but also trying to, how do you tie that to a future vision, right?
Yeah. So, I think one of the very tactical things that you have to do, right? So you build this relationship, you're going to cash in part of that relationship when you want to go about actually building, right? If you think about a system as people, processes, and tools, getting the tools you need to build a program, right? And I think a lot of folks who are in that first step might be just Excel, or maybe a SharePoint site. Maybe they've got ServiceNow or some other workflow tool that they're using. But I imagine that they're thinking about new tools. Like, what would you do? Like, how do you successfully make a case to a CIO or CTO? And then, like, what are common errors that folks might do when making that case? What should they stress? What words or concepts should they avoid?
Sure. Yeah. Well, I think I would still tie it back to those metrics, right? So like, what are the things that we want to be able to track against? What do we want to be able um, to automate and save money on, right? Like, how much time does this take currently? How much time should it take if we had a system that wasn't just in Excel, right? So I think turning it into those kind of trackable metrics makes it really compelling. But I think the other thing I would add is, thinking about how it starts to support other functions, right? Like, how will it enable visibility across the organization? How will it enable, how to think about fitting into engineering processes? How do you think about, supporting the kind of insights-driven business objectives, right? So like thinking about how each of those CIO priorities, right? Like that spread of 7 priorities is not just about like serving the privacy and security function. It is, how does the organization structure itself? How do you think about app dev? How do you think about, emerging tech opportunities, right? So really tying it into all of these functions and these kind of priorities of the tech exec in a way that's going to help them think about, these are the ways I want to push this forward. Where does it fit in here?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And where do you fit in, right? I think an important thing to realize that, the privacy software that you might buy is not the biggest purchase they'll make, and the purchases and investments that they're resting their career on, right? And making sure that this is something we think is kind of like central to our DNA, which is the idea of interoperability, right? That we need to embed privacy throughout the entire stack, right? We need to think about how do we connect and get that flow of information so that you can do your job and you can bring privacy to that end user, being, your colleague, the marketing, Salesforce administrator, any of these things. So
exactly,
it's really critical for us. One thing, obviously, you talked about sustained compliance, and I think you only need to sustain compliance if there are continually new compliance requirements. And we're seeing that. So at least in the US, we have these 2 or 3 new laws coming into effect in 2023. Like, how do you think about the technology investments that they need to make to prepare for this new environment versus maybe the technology investments that folks made when it was just one law, either CCPA or GDPR kind of preparation?
Sure. I mean, I'll go back to our kind of core concept, which is the future fit organization, and that is adaptive, creative, and resilient. And so adaptive and resilient are the key elements here, right? How are you going to not only address, what's coming down, January 1st of 2023, but there are a handful of proposed regulations, on the table that are also going to have impacts, right? And so what's going to happen there? How are you coordinating across the kind of patchwork problem? How are you running a multinational organization with, geo-specific requirements? All of that is increasingly complex. Like, we understand that it, at least for now, is only getting more complex, right? So how do you set that up, and how do you support and recognizing that complexity will continue, right? And I think that requires a system that's going to be responsive, automated, adaptive, and set you up for success, right? And so I think you'll go back to the CIO's positioning of like, well, the reason that we're in the cloud is because it's flexible. It's going to respond to our needs as they change, and it is not a system that we have to plan 10 years in advance to expect, how it's going to deprecate. And that's not our problem anymore, right? Like, we're not running data centers in our facilities anymore, right? So like, how do you think about that kind of real-time, responsive, adaptive approach to supporting all of this?
Yeah, and I think one of the things you mentioned was our needs, right? I think one of the parts about being early on in that maturity curve is that there's not one standard way of doing things. There's not one consistent privacy exposure or posture, right? Companies are facing a myriad of different laws and regulations and impact. They have these totally unique systems. And so, I think that gets to the one point, which is like making sure that, your whatever software you buy, it works for whatever company that you have built, right? The tail is not going to wag the dog on this, that you have to make sure that for your program to succeed, that the technology you use is empowering what's already there rather than trying to get everyone to meet you here. So,
right. Well, and the CIO's biggest, challenge, especially at a large enterprise, is like, some of them are in a position, in a holding company, like just trying to rationalize like how many ERP systems that they have under one roof, right? Like that are custom made, and like, so how do you fit into that environment, right? That is, and that's why many of those IT professionals are in that, bottom bucket of just like keeping this thing running, because we're dealing with legacy. Like this is the reality of what we've got going on in our stack, in our environment. So it's a huge range.
This has been just like a fascinating conversation. Thank you, Sarah. Sarah, last question. Like, if we could sum up, like, what are the three things, if you were sitting down, having an inquiry with the privacy officer today, like, and they're trying to sit down at a new company, those three things that they can do over the next year to improve their relationship with the CIO and tech executive, like, what would those be?
Okay, number one, I would say, don't get stuck in the like privacy and security bucket. Try to build the case that like privacy is a part of all of these functions that you care about and these priorities that you care about. So that's number one. Number two, I would say, like, start to imagine what those really modern future fit objectives could be, that you can start to actually position yourself closer to the business, less about, response and kind of compliance metrics, but rather like starting to tie to business outcomes. I think those are the two big things. Like,
great, amazing. Well, Sarah, thank you so much. Again, Sara Watson at Forrester, and again, my name is Stephen Jacobs, and I'm at WireWheel. We are a privacy management software company. Thank you everyone for attending. We'll be sending out a link to the replay in the next day or two. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach me at LinkedIn or email at stephen@wirewheel.io. So thank you so much, Sarah.
thank you.